Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Common Denominator. Before we continue, I'm thrilled to introduce the incredibly accomplished Vanessa Braganza, a true scholar and storyteller whose work bridges literature and law. She's currently pursuing her JD at Columbia Law School, where she specializes in constitutional law with a focus on civil rights. And before she turned to law, she was a PhD candidate in English at Harvard, where her research centered on Renaissance literature and the fascinating intersection between books, secrets, and identity. Her historical discoveries have been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, the London Times, Smithsonian Magazine, and other major media outlets worldwide. Her first book, The Secret Seekers, Renaissance Writers and the Birth of Code, explores how early modern writers used messages and hidden messages to shape the world around them. It's an honor to have you on today, and thank you so much for being here.
So pleased to be here.
So I'd just like to dive into the main topic today. And as I mentioned before in the introduction, we were talking about immigration rights in 2025. So I remember when I first met you when I was at this program, you mentioned that you were starting a research paper regarding ICE's use of racial profiling while detaining immigrants. And recently, after the controversy, especially surrounding Alligator Alcatraz, it's just been so clear that the war on immigrants has, in many ways, turned into a war against anyone who doesn't fit the general standards of eugenics from decades ago. And what's happening right now is that, like, especially what's happening this year with the US Supreme Court allowing immigration and custom enforcement, or also ICE, to resume immigration stops in LA using factors such as race, language, type of employment as a part of the justification to just capture them. And according to a recent Brookings analysis by Gabriel Sanchez and Edward Vargas, this decision could have had far-reaching effects on the Latino citizens, especially, and long-term residents, even people who have lived here for generations. So, what are your initial thoughts on this ruling, and what concerns does this raise about how immigration enforcement defines what looks like an immigrant or who looks like an immigrant?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the case that you mentioned is an emergency ruling by the Supreme Court brought handed down about 3 weeks ago now, called Nome versus Perdomo. And this was a case that concerned temporary ICE stops. So what the ruling was to permit ICE to use, as you say, what the court called apparent ethnicity, apparent race or ethnicity, as well as Spanish language usage, Spanish accent, and certain types of employment in determining whether to detain someone on a reasonable suspicion of being an illegal immigrant. And this is concerning for a couple of reasons. Uh, on in the first place, what's usually happens when the government makes distinctions based on race, it usually triggers the highest level of court skepticism. So these were claims brought under the Fourth Amendment, which is because they pertain to the seizure of persons, right? The Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. Usually, if you're not in a Fourth Amendment zone and you're not dealing with detentions or anything law enforcement related, if the government makes distinctions based on race, it triggers what the court calls strict scrutiny. And that means that the court starts from a presumption of saying, okay, we know historically race-based classifications tend to be discriminatory. And so we've learned we start from a presumption that they're basically invalid, um, and that they infringe upon the equal protection of people on the basis of race. Um, that gets that changes when you're in a law enforcement context, and that's what I found most initially concerning and really surprising about Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence and also even Justice Sotomayor's opinion. I was very surprised not to see any equal protection clause, Fifth Amendment, substantive due process issues, because usually race-based classifications have a presumptive invalidity. But what is concerning about this ruling is that in the first place, it presumes that an illegal immigrant fits a certain racial profile, um, that and that profile is very specifically Hispanic in appearance, and Spanish speaking, and likely to be found in certain places, usually places where places of employment where there's little documentation to go along with that employment. Um, the problem with this is that the logic is broken in two places. So-called apparent race or ethnicity doesn't necessarily correlate to actual race or ethnicity, and actual race or ethnicity doesn't necessarily correlate to immigration status. There are plenty of people who are Hispanic and naturalized, Hispanic and legal foreign nationals in the United States, Hispanic in ethnicity, and born citizens, um, and people who are neither Hispanic nor illegal, but who may appear Hispanic and on that basis be detained. So it's a racial profiling type of ruling. And even though the court tries to restrict it, there's a moment in Justice Kavanaugh's concurrence where he says, well, race can be a factor, but it can't be the determining factor. It doesn't matter. Um, it's still racial profiling and equal protection, which wasn't brought in this case, which would usually come in racial classifications, is uh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um, uh, tells us that these race-based classifications impose a heavy burden on, and racial profiling violates equal protections and imposes a heavy burden on the person being discriminated against. And that's the second thing that I found concerning about this, um, is that equal protection under the Constitution, under the Fifth and the 14th Amendments, um, they tell us that discrimination just by itself, racial discrimination, or any kind of discrimination based on a group, imposes such a heavy burden on people's rights just inherently that it carries this presumption of being invalid. It's so egregious to classify based on race, that those government classifications are presumed invalid. Um, what was concerning about the Perdomo ruling, about the Kavanaugh concurrence, was that the way in which it tried to make light of the burden on people being detained. And it did that because the types of stops, the types of ICE actions that it allowed ICE to use race for are so-called temporary stops. So these aren't arrests, these aren't incarceration, at least supposedly not. But what the court licensed was if an ICE officer has what we call in law a reasonable suspicion to suspect that someone is illegal, they have to be able to articulate a reason for that. And what the court said is that in stopping someone temporarily to, for example, ask for a passport or ask for proof of citizenship, that in those temporary stops, ICE could use race as a basis to temporarily stop someone. And what Justice Kavanaugh said was the stop is just temporary, and therefore it imposes a minimal burden on the person being stopped. And that's really quite disturbing because he even went so far as to say US citizens will inevitably get caught up in these stops and then they'll be let go and it's fine. It's not fine. And the equal protection under the Constitution tells us it's not fine. There is um, an inherent indignity, constitutional violation, violation of the most fundamental principles of the Constitution, in even classifying based on race. It's so suspect that in every other context we say no, we start from a presumption that it's not valid. So that's the long answer to your question. I found the race-based, the racial profiling to be extremely disturbing, and then I found the attempts to minimize it to be really disturbing, as well as contrary to usual equal protections doctrine.
Yeah, and I also liked how you mentioned the exact, like, I remember you said something about how if someone isn't even Hispanic or doesn't even have any association with that type of culture, if they showcase any sort of like facial features, or if their names sound similar, because I remember I was reading in the news, it was something about Alligator Alcatraz. This person got detained because his last name was Rodriguez. He had not a single like bone of Hispanic culture or just Latino or
Mhm.
Latinx culture within him. but he was detained anyways because of
Yeah.
just looking at his driver's license and seeing his name. And
Hmm.
even many Latino Americans, even those who are citizens, as you mentioned before, are now avoiding certain spaces or activities. And I think something that's happened recently is what's happening with the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl, I'm pretty sure Bad Bunny is going to be performing very soon, and he is seen as someone who's a representation in media for Latino culture and Latinx culture. But the Trump administration is deciding to place officers surrounding these areas, which is just incredibly disturbing. I don't even know if it's allowed. And I just want to hear your opinion, particularly for communities who are Latino. How will these laws right now and these orders by the current administration affect communities that are particularly targeted socially, psychologically, or even economically?
Yeah, by putting people in fear because they belong to a certain racial group, it's really striking at and violating in a really what should be a really embarrassing way for the government, and a very egregious way for people who either fit the profile of appearance and or are Hispanic in ethnicity. Um, that it puts them in fear of their safety, and it's doing it in a very aggressive way. Um, and it's this is actually why we have such a thing as the Equal Protections Clause. So the Equal Protections Clause, which I was talking about before, um, it's a clause within the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that government may not make any classification, may not make any law abridging a person's rights on the basis of race. And this governs states' actions. There is a doctrine within the Fifth Amendment called substantive due process, by which equal protection principles are extendable to the Fifth Amendment. Um, but the bottom line here is that these two amendments, they carry this principle that every single person uh, had in the United States has a right to be free from government persecution, specifically government persecution. They're both, the 14th Amendment is framed as no state shall make any shall make any law abridging. So it's not the document, the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment doesn't give people freedoms. And this is an interesting way that it was framed, right? It's not saying people have a right to be free of government persecution by race. It's actually framed as a restraint on government. The state shall make no law abridging. Um, and so that language is very clear. And so to place ICE and immigration authorities at the Super Bowl, knowing that there's a performer that means a lot to the Latino community, is pushing up against that restraint. And I think we've seen the Trump administration just breaking restraints left and right. But it's exactly the kind of tyranny that the Bill of Rights the language is framed to prevent. Um, so, uh, and again, this in terms of the Perdomo decision is why I was kind of surprised not to see the equal protection argument there at all. It was a purely Fourth Amendment case. It was a purely, is this an unreasonable seizure of persons kind of case? But equal protection has to come in, I think, because race comes in. So those are my thoughts, yeah, on that.
Yeah, I also liked how you like kind of we broke apart the 14th and 15th Amendment. And the fact that
14th
this
and
clause
5th.
is not 14th and the 5th, sorry.
And
14th, yeah, sorry about that. The 14th
you're
and the
good.
5th Amendment. And the fact that like I haven't looked at the 14th Amendment yet in class or anything, but breaking it down kind of like opened my eyes on how this is already there within our Constitution, within the structure of what this nation is kind of founded on, and how this administration is blatantly ignoring what has been there to like structure our nation is just really it's horrifying to see. And in addition to that, today I was in New York and I saw like the No Kings protest. And it was just really interesting to see. Like I saw a lot of signs saying due process exists and just so much for just representing the individuals who are currently suffering due to the administration and the mass deportations that are happening right now. And I just have noticed like these deportations and this targeting, it typically happens in cities that are primarily Democratic. And we see this with Chicago, we see this with New York City, we see this with LA. So many things are happening there, and the National Guard has been particularly being placed in these areas, attacking these Democratic urban cities with high immigrant populations. So why do you think the government is able to proceed with such and somewhat, I fear, I'm not too knowledgeable on this, that's why I'm asking you. I feel like it has to be somewhat uh, against the law to just target these areas due to their political identity. So how is the government still allowed to place the National Guard in such regions?
So it's where we're getting actually to the edge of where my knowledge is, but this much I can tell you that that kind of hostility, that kind of targeting, it really runs against the norms of the way that the federal and the state governments usually work with each other. There's a concept in law and in policy called federalism, and it refers to, and it changes over time, but it refers broadly to the nature of the interactions between federal and state. And it's not always a match made in heaven. It can be tense, it can be competitive, there can be very different, and there invariably are different competing democratic visions. One thing we haven't seen is the use of federal governmental power to punish and to retaliate in this retributive way. Um, uh, there's a scholar named Aziz Hook. He's a law professor at the University of Chicago, and he's recently come up with a term for this. He calls it agonistic federalism. That is this relationship that is so hostile that relations are essentially breaking down. Um, I suspect, and I don't want to speak on it without actually knowing firmly, but that I know that there are certain there must be limits on the president's ability to federalize, for example, state units of the National Guard. Um, the general sense that I'm getting is that this administration may be falling afoul of those. There are also other areas unrelated to immigration where the administration has already broken the letter of the law. So you will have seen a lot about funding restrictions, anti-DEI, the anti-DEI executive orders. Um, and the federal government's withholding of funding from states and from organizations that so-called promote DEI. Well, it turns out that the power of the purse, the power to allocate money, federal money, lies with Congress. It's in Article 1 of the Constitution. It's what we call a plenary power. It's a main power of Congress. And there is a federal law called the Impoundment Control Act, um, which heavily restricts, almost to a vanishing point, the president's ability to interfere with already appropriated and allocated funds. And we've seen the Trump administration doing that. So it wouldn't surprise me at all, given that he's violated the plain letter of the law in other respects, like appropriations and impoundment of federal funds, that the federalization of state units of the National Guard may also be in violation of plain law.
Yeah, so building off of that, I was wondering in what ways can states kind of resist or challenge its federal overreach? Because I've seen in Illinois, I'm not too sure, but I think the governor of Illinois or the mayor of Chicago sued Trump or sued the administration. And will that actually have an impact later on in the future for individuals living within the city? How would this actually impact the people who are targeted and the victims of the administration?
That's a great question, and because it sounds good, right? Sue, it even sounds good to say, right? I'll sue you, and then what does it actually do? And the answer is that when you sue someone, you sue for what we in law call relief. So you can sue for different forms of relief that may be appropriate to the situation. So if you rear end my car, um, and you refuse to give me your insurance information, I would sue you for the cost of repairing the car. So that's money damages. In this case, what states are suing for is something called an injunction, and that is a court order saying, requiring the defendant, in this case the government, to stop. So if you have a state suing, for example, to enjoin the federalization of the state National Guard, then the way in which, if it succeeds, if the court finds for the state, it provides the residents of the state with relief because it would place the state National Guard back in the control of the state. Um, this is getting complicated because I don't know if you saw it today, there were several news pieces. Justice Amy Coney Barrett has actually, she gave an interview where she intimated that the Supreme Court may not actually be able to enforce its orders against the president. And that's a procedural kind of detail because presidents, not all of them, I can think of one exception, but presidents and parties before the court usually respect court orders. But if they don't, the enforcement for a court to the enforcement mechanism is for the Supreme Court, the U.S. Marshal's Office, and the Marshal's Office is actually located inside the Department of Justice. And so the enforcement mechanism is within a government agency that the president controls. And so that's kind of the reason that's the reason that I would put behind to her statement that maybe the court can't enforce the orders that it issues. So that's the relief that a lawsuit can provide, and that's why it may not be such a given anymore that a lawsuit can provide that relief. Um, in terms of other things that states can do, um, I tend to think that one of the biggest things that states can do, and we're seeing this in Illinois and we're seeing it out of California, um, is to be a really strong, is for governors of states and even mayors of cities to provide a really strong public voice, refusing to accept the the actions of this administration. And that sounds maybe at first blush like it's just words, but as we were just talking about, so much of the power of putting people in fear of persecution on the basis of race is that those kinds of that kind of behavior by the government, it makes people stay inside. It makes people fall silent. Um, and and one of the I think best things that states and city leadership can model that people will follow is to be really loud in refusing to accept this because after all we live in a democracy and the power lies with the people, and whether that voice and whether that condemnation of these actions bears fruit maybe in the next election, people need something to hang on to. And so the louder and more organized and more visible in their leadership state and city leaders are, I think the better chance we have in the midterms, in the next election, to elect an administration that is the opposite of this one, that will not break the law left, right, and center. And so that's a longer term fix, but it starts with speech and it starts with democracy doing what it does best, which is speaking up against tyranny. And then that ideally yields fruit at the ballot box.
Yeah, and when you mentioned the fact that we have the power to change, we have the power to, the people have the power in one or another to get involved, to vote, to protest, like the No Kings protest happening today, happening in DC. I saw so many videos of people that I know personally in DC at the rally, and just I saw clips of Bernie Sanders. I saw this this podcaster that I really like, Mehdi Hassan. I don't know if you know him, but I really like listening to. You should listen to him. He's really
Oh,
he's I really love his podcast. It's called Zateo. Sorry, going off track,
I'm
but
gonna write that down.
yeah, you should definitely listen to him. But seeing all these protests shows the power people have, especially when these protests happen in the LA, what happened in LA as well. It showed that it's not just the administration that is kind of holding power over the people, and especially people who are seen as victims. And it's not really the case that people are like Latino communities are victims to this. It's just that the administration is targeting them in a manner that turns them into victims. But in reality, these individuals are strong. These people are
Mhm.
strong. They like people who are immigrants. I feel like every single immigrant has the strength within them because they've
Mhm.
moved from one place that they're completely used to somewhere new and made a whole lifestyle. And just for it to be knocked down, just for the administration to just completely knock that down. So, what do you think that Latino communities or just general immigration groups, immigrant groups, what do you think they can do to understand that this situation is not going to be forever, that it's going to pass, and we shouldn't be just living in this constant state of fear at all times.
Yeah. One of the most inspiring things that I think has come out of ICE's raids in the past year is the emergence of community solidarity. You know, we're seeing folks who are not Hispanic or Latino or Hispanic presenting, who are warning people where there are ice traps in their cities, and so that offers a resource that Hispanic and Latino people can avail themselves of in more than one way. That there are these supportive people in their communities, and I think one of the best things that they can do is to develop good, strong relationships, strong friendships. Remember also that democracy it's about the power residing with the people. Government has power because we give it power. Um, it's also about very different kinds of people coming together and across differences and forging relationships. And in a sense, that those communities that we're seeing supporting Hispanic and Latino residents are some of the most powerful examples of democracy now. And so if you're Hispanic or Latino, look for the people in your community that you can develop those good and caring relationships with. It's a source of hope. It's a source of support. It's a source of democracy. Um, and it's a source of the reality that these people are Americans too. They belong within our communities. They belong within our country. They have an equal voice. They have equal rights. Um, and so I think that community building is really important.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with the fact that you mentioned about community building. And I see this within not only in America, but I'm from Canada, right? I've seen it there too. Like I've seen the solidarity that people across the globe have with individuals in America who are struggling, who are constantly in that state of fear. And
Mhm.
I just feel like it just gained broader like support for just having empathy with each
Mhm.
other. Yeah, and that's just something that I feel like everyone should have. And something that's kind of distorted this sense of empathy. I'm just gonna end off with just this note about media right now, because
Mhm.
obviously media is incredibly polarizing. We see things that from one side and the other, and it just this polarized community that we live in right now that's kind of shaped our image of what the typical immigrant looks like. And that's how the administration is getting their information. They're getting it from the media. They're getting it from
Mhm.
what they see the media showcases an immigrant is like. Because the other day, if I see uh just something from ProggerU, do you have an idea what ProggerU?
I don't, but tell
It's
me.
this like organization, this like educational organization that aims
Mhm.
towards promoting this like conservative mindset. Like I remember there was this like video talking about Frederick Douglass, and he was like, "Oh, it's okay if that we had slavery. It's kind of bad, but it was all right for this time." So it was made by I think Tucker Carlson, and it was just there to
Doesn't surprise me.
promote. Yep, yeah, just to promote this conservative mindset. So this is what the media is kind of shaping one side of the political spectrum. So, how do you think this perception of hypocrisy, fear of partisanship within the media is affecting our images of what we believe is actually happening in the real world?
So the last point I'll make, and it's not a legal one, it's a human one, is that when the media projects the image that an American looks a certain way and doesn't look a certain way, uh, that the groups that get affirmatively excluded feel as though they don't belong in this country. And that's contrary to what the Constitution has in mind. It's contrary to the idea of we the people, who look more than one way, who have more than one set of experiences, who bring more than one set of talents, and they're not just varied by race, they're varied by individual. Um, so that the media and the power of the media to exclude is tremendous and to make people feel like they don't belong. And actually, you could flip the coin and say the power of the media to include is also tremendous if only it doesn't have to be media conglomerates. It could be someone who's a freelance journalist. It could be photographers. It can be film directors, right? It can be TikTok influencers or podcast hosts who create a space that resist things like the Perdomo decision or the media's representation and make clear that no, Americans look more than one way. And have more than one set of experiences and create inclusive spaces for that true statement. So that also is the power of the voice of the people, and I think that's a good note to finish on.
And the fact that you mentioned about like media as a whole being such a huge influence in our lives, like that's why I actually started this podcast because of how much media influences me as a person, watching movies, listening to podcasts, reading the news every single day. It just has influenced me, and seeing these different sources say different things, it's just been so hard for me to understand because on one end it will be describing someone from my background as someone who is not talented, who is not doing the right thing, and just displaying them as someone that is just a bad person due to stereotypes has been just affected by me. And that's basically what racial profiling is. Racial profiling is just a set of stereotypes that build upon each other. And now the government is just listening to these stereotypes and judging whether or not a person has the right to exist within a country that is supposedly supposed to be a land of opportunity and a land of where you're supposed to grow as a person. And it's just been really embarrassing to see the administration's reaction to the protests that are happening lately because I remember I heard somewhere I was reading the news and it was saying that the administration is calling the No Kings protest a hate America protest or an anti-America protest,
Mm.
which makes no sense to me. But it is what it is for now, and I hope it's just going up from here because I feel like the newer generations right now and the people who are currently building up to what the government will become or what is going on right now. And I'm whatever is happening in New York City with me personally, I'm just going to throw my political opinion out there. I love Zohran Mamdani currently.
Mm.
I love his ideologies. I love his policies. I've been following him before he had a million followers on Instagram. And it's just been such a joy seeing someone who isn't like 70 years old running for government
Yeah.
actually display their ideas out there. And I'm just excited to see what the future has to bring and how this will impact individuals who are currently being targeted by those who might be a little bit too old in the seat right now. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and share
My
your
pleasure.
thoughts. And your perspective really shed a lot of light and will help me analyze this issue in further detail. Thank you so much. And
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
yeah, have a great rest of your day.
You too.